Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries and constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. Before we start, I want to mention that I was recently introduced to a company, Magic Mind, who send me samples of their product that boosts energy and focus. The ingredients are all natural, including organic matcha green tea, lion's mane mushrooms, cordyceps, choline, ashwagandha, turmeric, and vitamin C and D. The product is well formulated and nicely packaged, a small bottle for a single dose that can be consumed in a few seconds. I found the product very useful to keep me focused, reduce stress, elevate mood, enhance cognition, and generally keep a healthy immune system. I found it particularly useful when I'm tired. There are no controlled clinical trials yet, but the company is working on it so that consumers can have excellent scientific data as well. I would recommend you try it and let the company know of your feedback. They love to hear from their customers. The product is called Magic Mind and is available in most online retail stores. You get 1 month for free when you're subscribing for 3 months at www.magicmind.com slash Jan Scientific Sense. That is JAN Scientific Sense. And with the code EAPEN20, EAPEN 20. It's an extra 20% off, which gets you a total of 75% off. This only lasts until the end of January. So I would strongly recommend you try. My guest today is Professor James Robinson, who is Professor of Global Conflict Studies and University Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His work explores the underlying causes of economic and political divergence, both historically and today, and uses both the mathematical and quantitative methods of economics, along with the case study, qualitative, and fieldwork methodologies used in other social sciences. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. So we want to focus on one of your books. I know that you have written several, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, Why Nations Fail. I found the book really fascinating, James. So to set the context for the general public, I had an appetizer, a short appetizer at University of Chicago in the 90s. And I knew the five-course meal that followed would have been exceptionally great, but I didn't stay for the meal. And so both of us, in some sense, have a little bit of a bias, the Chicago school bias. Um, and so I think what we talk about is might be in that context. And so let me ask you up front, what is the book about?
Well, the book proposes a way to think about, poverty and prosperity in the world. Why is the distribution, why does the distribution of income and prosperity in the world look the way it does? And what's the difference between poor countries and rich countries? And how did they get that way? Looking kind of more historically, how did this divergence take place in the world? That's what it's about.
So prosperity divergence. So I want to sort of go through the book. So to set the context, in the preface, you say here why Egyptians filled Tahrir Square to bring down Hosni Mubarak, and what it means for our understanding of the causes of prosperity and poverty. So Egypt is a long case study. A lot of things have happened there. And I don't know if you talk about this in the book, James, about the Arab Spring related issues. So what do you mean? What do you mean here?
Yeah, I mean that's trying to set the scene, looking at the Arab Spring, and I think that's particularly important for us because, we're sort of trying to think about, why, why is Egypt poor, and we say Egypt is poor because it has what we call extractive economic institutions. It has the economy is organized in ways which benefit a few at the expense of the majority of people. Okay, so the basic story in the book about what's the difference between poor countries and rich countries, at the sort of most fundamental level, it's to do with the way the economies are organized. A poor country like Egypt has extractive economic institutions, and a much more prosperous country like the United States has inclusive economic institutions, and that's economic institutions kind of rules. By institutions I just mean like rules that create patterns of incentives and opportunities, and inclusive economic institutions create broad-based patterns of incentives and opportunities. They're inclusive. In Egypt, there are incentives and opportunities, but they're for the few and not for the majority. But why that economy is organized like that is fundamentally political. So the kind of yes, there's the economics is important, but lying behind the economics is important. And Egypt has extractive economic institutions because it has extractive political institutions. Political power is concentrated narrowly, in the hands of a military dictator. And so the Arab Spring is fascinating because it's also, it's both about, why is Egypt or Tunisia or Syria poor, but also how could it become less poor? How could institutions change from being extractive to inclusive? And that's about contestation, really. It's about the organization of the people who suffer under extractive institutions. And that's what the Arab Spring was all about. It was people suffering under extractive institutions who organized, who kind of pushed against it and tried to make a transition. But the Arab Spring is also fascinating because it shows you how difficult that is. Because if you look at Egypt today, yes, the Arab Spring removed one military dictator, and now you have a different one in power. And that's something we call the iron law of oligarchy. So the book is both about, why poor countries are like the way they are, how that's connected to the structure of their institutions, how you change those institutions, but why it's so difficult to change those institutions. And that's something that creates a lot of kind of inertia and persistence in the world.
And so if I look at it longitudinally, James, so it seems to me that the initial conditions matter a lot. So where you start matters a lot, right? Is that the right way to think about it?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. I mean, early on in the book, we tell this story of the Americas, of divergence within the Americas. The fascinating, if you go back a few hundred years, the United States wasn't more prosperous than the rest of the Americas. But for historical reasons to do with, how colonialism got organized in the New World, the United States started with much more inclusive institutions than Latin American countries did, and that created enormous, differences in the possibilities in the 19th century. When the Industrial Revolution started in England, it spread to the United States, it didn't spread to Latin America. Why? Because Latin America didn't have the same inclusive institutions that the United States did. And those things persist. Those things persist today. Like I was emphasizing, a lot about this sort of the inertia of these institutions. I think, if you want to understand the difference between North America and Latin America today, you do have to go back into the colonial period and understand how these societies got constructed in different ways, and the different sort of possibilities and opportunities that created for North America and Latin America. But in some sense, it's a historical process, and it's a somewhat idiosyncratic process also. I don't think personally, and this is the argument in the book, there's no intrinsic reason why any part of the world is poor or any other part of the world is rich. That's to do with the way that people themselves create those societies, and that's a function of power and incentives, but also historical contingency, as you say.
You also mentioned a lot of reversals. So, I mean, we'll go into the book, but Argentina, Soviet Union, I think you mentioned India. India had some help from England for the race to the bottom. But these reversals, are they sort of predictable based on the conditions that we see?
No, I mean that's like we sort of try to emphasize there that the sort of the big story historically is in the kind of creation of prosperity, like in Britain, in the Industrial Revolution, or in North America, is to do with the emergence of inclusive institutions. But I think we also kind of want to emphasize that in any inclusive society, there's always incentives to create extractive institutions. The leading example, that we discuss a lot is Venice. In the late Middle Ages, Venice might have been the most prosperous place in the world. It had this enormous commercial empire all over the Mediterranean. It was very innovative in many types of commercial contracts, institutions, in the financial sector, but it all went into reverse because the inclusive institutions were basically overthrown by a political coup that created a far more extractive political system that then reversed the economic inclusion. So I think, so part of the point of those examples is to say, inclusive institutions are never guaranteed. You always have to try to fight for them and maintain them, that there's always incentives for people to put that into reverse. I think looking at history is powerful from that perspective.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about this, James, later. So anything could sort of go back. So you cannot take anything for granted in any system. It just takes a few people or one person, or a group of people. And so in the first chapter here, you say Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora have the same people, culture, and geography. Why is one rich and one poor? So Sonora is in Mexico, Arizona is in the US, and it is an area that is just divided. Is it divided by a river, these two
No, it's
areas?
just a fence, basically. Yeah.
Just a fence, okay. So why is one rich and one poor?
Well, because the one Nogales on the US side of the border has far more inclusive institutions than Nogales on the Mexican side of the border. I mean, we like that example. We find that example very sort of visceral, because it's what I would call a natural experiment. That it's not an experiment the way that one would do in the natural sciences. But there's sort of experimental like variation in institutions, in the sense that many other things are held constant. Geography is held constant, culture is held constant. That can't be what creates this difference. It's the institutional differences that that are significant. We also use this example of like North and South Korea also.
Yeah.
Which is very kind of powerful, I think. So it's these institutional differences and the very different patterns of incentives and opportunities they create that makes Nogales in the United States so much more prosperous than Nogales in Mexico.
So North and South Korea, Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora. So you're rejecting the hypothesis, and this is one of the hypotheses, that prosperity is driven by people, culture, and geography. The geographical characteristics, it could be weather, it could be a lot of other things. And you're citing examples here that shows these things are pretty close together. They're the same people, same culture, but we see a distinct economic difference between them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not a story of good guy or bad guy, or, we use this example of, Carlos Slim and Bill Gates, who were the two richest people in the world at the time we wrote the book. And, they're both, very brilliant, driven, entrepreneurs, and they were the two richest men in the world. But what's fascinating is the very different way that they made their money. Bill Gates made his money through innovation. Carlos Slim made his money through monopolies. And they're just responding to the very different institutional environment in
Well, one could
Mexico.
argue Bill Gates also made
Well,
his money through monopoly.
of course, but that's part of the story. But that shows that Bill Gates isn't, it's not because he's a good guy. If he could get away with being a monopolist, he'd do it. It's just more difficult to do it in the United States. Microsoft was found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Like, they have great antitrust laws in Mexico, but you'd never be able to enforce them on Carlos Slim. So I think that's a key aspect of sort of showing that humans are the same everywhere, but you put them in different institutional environments, they're going to behave in different ways, which have enormous consequences for the societies they're living in.
Yeah, so let me take a quick detour here, James. So we have contemporary antitrust litigation going on. There's a large search company that we have, and they have tens of thousands of lawyers. They have been able to kick the ball down the road, or what the right term is. And now the case is not going to be taken up till like 2026 or something. And so are we coming into a position that, I mean, I understand your point, but even in the US, if you have tens of thousands of lawyers, you can get around this stuff pretty easily, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a live question as to whether what happened to Bill Gates, 25 years ago, whatever it was, could actually happen now. I think, one thing we've seen in the United States, I think, is that institutions are becoming much less inclusive in many ways. Social mobility has fallen. There's been enormous increase in inequality. If you look at innovators, for example, like one thing we discuss in the book, is if you look historically at innovators in the United States, they come from enormously diverse social backgrounds. So that's not true anymore now. People who come from wealthy households are many more times likely to innovate than people who come from poor households. So I think you see many aspects of inclusion in the United States have been going into the reverse in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think, that what you're describing is how that's spilling over, into the ineffectiveness of the institutions that in the past were very important for sustaining inclusion. So I completely agree with that. Yes. I think that's one of the big concerns that we have today in the United States.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about that later. So in the second chapter here, James, you say poor countries are poor, not because of geographies or cultures, and we talked about a couple of examples of this, or because the leaders do not know which policies will enrich their citizens. So this is the alternative hypothesis that you have incompetent leaders who are making bad policies, right? So what is the evidence that we have against that?
Against
Against bad leaders making
Well, I think
countries
there's
poor.
all. I think there's always bad leaders and there's always good leaders. I mean, I think what we know on average is that I mean, there's some very interesting research about exactly on this topic of the impact of leaders. About whether or not when leaders die in office. So let's just say for some reason you have a heart attack or whatever, the leader dies and you get a new leader. So do you see any significant change, say, in public policy or economic performance? And the answer is yes, you do see significant change, but on average, it's not any better for economic performance. Things can get better, things can get worse. You get good leaders, you get bad leaders, but on average, there's no real impact. So I think, I think, good leadership is great if you can get it. I think, bad leadership is very common also. And I think, what the evidence suggests is that it's very difficult to explain systematic patterns of economic development by the character of leaders, and to the extent that's true, I think, we would tend to think that it's because, some types of institutions, like maybe democratic institutions, are better at selecting good
Mm,
leaders, although, you can probably think of counterexamples to that too. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, so when I think about leaders, I think about Angela Merkel, I think about Jacinda Ardern, and I look at some of the other examples that we have around the world. They are dramatically opposite personalities, characteristics, ideas, ideologies. But what you're arguing is that the system matters, not the individual, right?
I think individuals do matter. I mean, I think individuals do matter. That I think it would be silly to argue that. What I'm saying is that, you can't explain why the United States, has become so successful over the past 200 years relative to Latin America, say, by just saying, oh, the United States had a bunch of really good leaders and Latin America didn't. I think that's that's what I'm saying. The leaders surely matter, but if you think about these systematic patterns, that's not about leadership. It's about the underlying institutions.
So leaders are, I mean, this is new insight for me, James. So leaders are, in some sense, if I understand this correctly, is a second order effect. If you don't have the right system, if you don't have free markets, free trade, liberty, general concepts um, of these things, then you could have a great leader, but that leader is going to take tens or many decades before he can turn the country around. It's like a big ship that he or she is trying to drive.
Yeah, so you can't sustain, the benefits that any benefits you create. To sustain things, you have to institutionalize things. You can have transitory successes, but you can't consolidate that. I guess I would say, I mean, I think about Deng Xiaoping. For me, Deng Xiaoping was a sort of remarkable person. It's difficult to argue that he was not important, in the turnaround in Chinese economic development from the late 1970s. But he failed to institutionalize, the system that he tried to create. He tried to create term limits, for example, and that's fallen apart now in
Mm.
China. President Xi got rid of all, and is now
Yeah.
consolidating personal political power in a way that Deng Xiaoping tried to stop.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit, take a detour there, James. So China is a good contemporary example. It has been exceptionally successful. As I mentioned, I grew up in India in 1960s. GDP per capita, China and India was about $2,000. China is now 10x that. India is maybe 3,000, 3,500. So India has progressed incrementally. It's about the same number of people in both of these countries, but China has a tremendous growth. And so how do you attribute that to? Is that leadership or is that system?
I think, I mean, I think that's, we don't talk much about India in Why Nations Fail. We talk much more about it in the sequel, The Narrow Corridor. I'd say a few things about that. I'd say one is, in the Chinese case, the theory we have kind of seems to fit very well in some dimensions and not very well in other dimensions. And let me explain that. It's clear that the economic transition that took place in China, from the late 1970s is sort of exactly a movement from extractive to much more inclusive
Mm.
institutions. The Communist Party dismantled communism. It created incentives in agriculture, to start with this household responsibility system. It let people make decisions. It made them the residual claimants on their efforts. There was a huge increase in productivity. This sort of spreads to the manufacturing and industry in the 1980s. So the economic transition is exactly moving towards more inclusive institutions. Like, what doesn't fit is that the politics are still very extractive. The politics are still controlled by the Communist Party, whereas our theory is about, you have to, if you want to have a really inclusive economy, that has to be underpinned by inclusive political institutions, and you don't have that in China. So what do I say about that? I say that's a transitory situation. That China doesn't have the political model to become a really successful economy. Like you mentioned the Soviet Union and Argentina earlier on. Those are two fantastic examples. Like the Soviet Union grew extremely rapidly for about 50 years, from the mid 1920s, when they set up this kind of central planning operation. It grew very rapidly. When I was a student in England 40 years ago, we learned that if you wanted to be successful economically, you had to have Soviet style central planning. I mean, that sounds completely crazy to everybody now. Everyone's forgotten that the Soviet Union was thought of as an economic miracle. Of course, there's many differences between China and the Soviet Union, but I think it should lead everyone to pause for a minute to when they think about how everyone was fooled by 30 or 40 years of rapid economic growth in the Soviet Union, like it was a sort of chimera. So of course there's many differences, with the Chinese experience, but the Soviet experience was transitory, and I would say, we would say, you can't have an inclusive economy at the whim of a dictatorship, and so it will collapse. I don't know how it will collapse or when it will collapse, but what history suggests is, in the same way that nobody predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse or how the Soviet Union would collapse, but it did collapse. And I think the same will happen with China, So I think that's what I say about China. I think the Indian case is sort of fascinating, because but when we wrote Why Nations Fail, it was sort of outside the scope of our kind of scholarship, So we've been trying, obviously, like at some level, political institutions in India are much more inclusive. It's a very vibrant democracy, but inclusive political institutions, from our perspective, there's two parts of that. One is this element of kind of participation and broad-based political power, but the state, the capacity and the effectiveness of the state is very important. I mean, what China has is a centralized state that's much better at getting things done than in India. I think the problem in India is that the state lacks capacity. I think also, India, and this is something which, is kind of a bit outside of our theory, at some sociological level, there's big problems of inclusion in India. If you think about like this whole caste system, the caste system is enormously anti-inclusive, if you like. I mean, that's a kind of sociological thing, which is almost outside of our theory, as I say. But I think if you look at Indian society, you can see, the state is very bad at kind of providing key public goods, but there's also other elements of extractive institutions that make it very difficult to have social mobility of the sort that's kind of really required. Look at what happens when you take Indians out of India and put in other institutional environments. They're unbelievably successful.
Well, there's a bias sample problem there.
There's selection, of course. There's selection, of course. But I do think that's, that, of course, there's selection. But I, so that's what I would say about India. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to throw a wrench into this, James, just peripherally. So I grew up in the southern state of India called Kerala. When India got independent in 1947, the first government that they elected was a Marxist government. They call it a Marxist government. And since then, it has been off and on. They come in for 5 years, and somebody else comes in for 5 years, and they come back for 5 years. They're not quite Marxist. They are sort of, in your terminology, I would think they're more inclusive. I mean, this might be a research topic. I haven't really studied the data, but the state is quite successful, actually. 100% literacy, very good healthcare, about 2x GDP per capita compared to the rest of the country. And so, I mean, it is sort of ambiguous, right? So I think, I'm sort of gravitating to your thesis, which is, it is sort of inclusivity that ultimately makes things happen. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, of course, India is very heterogeneous. There's many different regional cultures and regional histories and languages. And I think Kerala is fascinating, because, you could go back even, I mean, the standard sort of story, that Amartya Sen or whatever would tell would go, much further back in history and start talking about this Travancore, is it this pre-colonial polity and,
Yeah.
like there are sort of deep roots for how Kerala kind of a very different type of society emerged in Kerala, and some people also emphasized, this aspect of like, matrilineal inheritance and even kind of,
Yeah.
like a sort of, again, like more sociological, women's empowerment, for example, also tends to be, very different in Kerala than other parts of India. And so, so I think it's an interesting example just to show there's very big differences. I mean, India is such a heterogeneous place,
Yeah, it's a very complex story. So if you do a multifactorial regression, there's too many factors to control for. So in chapter 3, you say how prosperity and poverty are determined by the incentives created by institutions, and how politics determines what institutions a nation has. So ultimately, for people to do better things, they need to have incentives, right? I mean, that's sort of the fundamental idea here, right? So if somebody takes over a country and say, you go work in the field and then you pay 99% taxes, that person wouldn't have
yeah.
any incentive to do anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's not our idea. Economic theory is all about incentives, and so I take that. I tend not to dwell on that part because I find like every economist knows that, but what they don't know is like, if it's so great to have incentives, and if incentives come from institutions, which I think we know as well. You mentioned markets. What are markets? Markets an institution. It creates incentives, to allocate resources efficiently, for people to move to jobs where their talents are like most productively used, like that's an institution. But then the question, becomes, well, if it's so great to have these institutions, like why doesn't everybody have them? Why don't they create them in Haiti, or why don't they create them in Nigeria, or like what that, and that's where the politics comes in. And I think
Mm.
that's the real contribution of the book, relative to what Milton Friedman knew, for example.
Yeah, so this goes into in chapter 4, you say how institutions change through political conflict and how the past shapes the present. So we talked a bit about this. So I want to get your perspective on this. So it seems to me, without knowing anything about this, James, it seems to me that initial conditions matter a lot. So where you start sort of gets you where you're going to end in some ways, unless something dramatic changes, right? Is that true?
I think that's true. Yeah, there's enormous persistence in the world. I think, we there's persistence of inclusive institutions, but there's also persistence in extractive institutions, this takes us back to the Arab Spring, where it's just sort of a moment where very deeply seated extractive institutions were sort of challenged, but they more or less they more or less emerged unscathed everywhere. So I think and one of the generalizations we have in the book is to sort, once you see that, and you see in Latin America, there have been countless revolutions in Latin America, or attempts to kind of fight against extractive institutions, but extractive institutions often get recreated, so that's just to say these initial conditions you're talking about, they're enormously important in, once a society gets set off in a particular direction, then there's enormous inertia. There's enormous inertia in that, and if you think about this example of the Americas, we know these big differences in prosperity in the Americas today. If you went back 50 years, that would be extremely similar. If you went back 100 years, it would be extremely similar. If you went back 100, so that these patterns of, the United States and Canada, then maybe Argentina, Chile, and Central America at the bottom, that's been enormously persistent like that for a long time. Okay, if you went back 500 years, of course, it wouldn't be there. In fact, you'd find something completely different before colonization came. If anything, prosperity and kind of the development of civilization was much more advanced in Mexico, and Central America, Andean South America than it was anywhere in North America. So, if you go back far enough in history, you see actually there's been an enormous sort of reversal, and that reversal was created by European colonialism and European settlement, and how that created very different types of societies in different parts of the Americas. So, I guess when Professor Acemoglu and I, when we first started working on these topics kind of 30 years ago, a lot of the discussion was dominated by these very simplistic kind of accounts of like Professor Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, who was sort of promoting the idea that countries that were in the tropics were intrinsically poor compared to, countries that were in temperate latitudes, and I think that's completely wrong, like it's just wrong. It's just really the way the world looks today. There's nothing sort of, there's nothing definitive. There's no definitive connection, to geography or ecology or anything like that. It's just a kind of layered history of human innovation and settlement and creation but what happens in the past has these enormous, inertial consequences, and these initial conditions are very important. And once they get going, it's very hard to perturb. If you think about China, one of the things we point out in the narrow corridor, where we sort of talk much more about the deeper kind of historical dynamics of China. Again, if you went back in history, you'd see many things in China that were similar to the history of Western Europe in terms of like parliament and representation and kind of the involvement of people in politics. But then once you get the creation of this first dynasty, about 200 BC in China, then you get into this kind of path which sort of reinforces itself, of the dominance of the state over society, of extractive institutions, a whole ideology that comes around it. That's not something we deal with too much in Why Nations Fail, because, we're economists, so it's difficult to deal with ideology. But it's obvious in the Chinese case that, or even in the Indian case, like we were talking about the caste system. Well, the caste system is fits into these kind of religious beliefs also, So it's not just an economic institution, though. It's deeply embedded in the culture, and that's the same thing in China. So we're doing a lot of research on that at the moment. But culture is very badly studied by economists, as you're probably aware. So.
Yeah. So I mean, there's some tactical, I don't know the right term, tactical perturbations here, James. So I don't know the exact numbers, but something like 3/4 of GDP of the US are created by first generation immigrants. So they reached the country 1960s onward. We have one of the greatest presidents just waiting to return, want to shut down immigration. So what do you think that will do to the US?
Oh, I think it would be a disaster. I think like one of the reasons why the United States has been so dynamic, over the past 200 years is it created, it became a magnet to suck talent from all over the world, and I think that's one of the major things it actually has in its favor, and if it shuts that down, then it's a disaster for the future of innovation and economic growth in the United States. But, that's the story of extractive institutions. Extractive institutions are for some people's benefit, but at the expense of social welfare, So just as Venice shut itself down, of course, the United States could shut itself down too. And I think like what we've learned, in the past 5, 6, years or more, is that there's far less commitment in the United States to inclusive institutions than anyone imagined. That we have the end. I certainly didn't imagine, when we wrote that book. With the book, we're often criticized for being very optimistic about the United States. And I think that's because, I work a lot in developing countries. I worked for for 30 years in Colombia, all over sub-Saharan Africa. I just came back from, working in Nigeria a week ago. And when you've been in Nigeria for a few weeks, or Colombia, and you come to the United States, you appreciate.
You can see the contrast. You
Yeah,
can
you
see
see
the status
things
quo
that work.
contrast.
You
Yeah.
see all the things that work in this country, and so it's very difficult for me to be pessimistic about the United States. But I, there are these things going on that you just identified that are I find like frightening, honestly, as an economist, yeah, or as a citizen.
Yes. So in chapter 5, you say here what Stalin, Kim Siam, and Neolithic Revolution and the Maya city-states all had in common, and how this explains why China's current economic growth cannot last. So this is a pretty difficult hypothesis, in the sense that we have very little data on this, right? I'll just throw it out to you. Let you react to it. Yeah.
Yeah, we try, like I think we're social scientists. So, what you do in social sciences, you develop a sort of simple theory and then you try to push it as far as possible. So I think the examples you're talking about is, we're taking our theory and we're trying to push it as far as possible. So the Maya city-state, the Maya collapse is a sort of fantastic example where, talking about how prosperous Central America was, this is 1,000 years ago,
Yeah.
you have this blooming in Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, of these Maya societies. They were very innovative in terms of institutions, building public goods, roads, cisterns, whatever, uh, um, but they collapsed. It all went into decline. The civilizations went into decline. And the cities depopulated and were abandoned. And by the time the Spaniards got to that part of Latin America, that they were all overgrown. These places were the splendor of these Maya cities was only discovered, starting in the 19th century, really. So we just try to take what we know, what archaeologists know or historians know about how Maya society was organized and what might have caused this kind of reversal, to say, here's how we'd apply our ideas to think about these kind of reversals in Maya society. Could we explain the collapse of the Maya city-states as a kind of transition from something which was more inclusive to less, inclusive or more extractive? But those examples, as you say, the evidence is limited, so there's going to be an element of kind of speculation, to say the least. But that's social science is like that. We're on much firmer ground in more contemporary situations, obviously. Yeah, where the data is better and we know a lot more.
I mean, technically, it's an optimization problem. So, I am very fond of the Chicago School ideas. If you have the right incentives, you put the people together into a system, they will all do, what they could do, and the system will improve. But if you have, as you say, extractive elements in there, then your incentives are going to decline. And, it all depends on where you start from, but generally it declines, the status of society, right? So, I want to get your perspective on, I don't know if this is in the research, James. So if you look at Scandinavia, for instance, these are small countries, less than 10 million people, or New Zealand or something like that. They all seem to be doing pretty well. The happiness index, for instance, all come out pretty good. I don't know the GDP growth. I mean, I haven't looked at GDP per capita growth or anything like that. So is GDP per capita growth a really interesting metric for society in the future?
I mean, I think so. I think the problem with, using GDP as a metric is, it's not taking into account, for example, the use of environmental resources or the degradation of the environment. That's not priced into.
It's an external cost that's not accounted for. Yeah.
Exactly. So there is very innovative work, trying to come up with these new versions of national accounts that take that sort of thing into account. Partha Dasgupta, who's a professor, a professor at the University of Cambridge in England, did kind of path-breaking work on this. It hasn't really caught on. There's a very developed academic literature on this, but you don't see countries really announcing these numbers. Which is it would be a step. It would be a step if they did that. Because it would make people much more conscious, of the consequences of what's going on. So I think I think you're right that that there's from that perspective, there's a problem with looking at GDP per capita. I just think that if we think about the world over the past couple of 100 years, the trajectory of GDP per capita actually is pretty informative about which countries have been successful at improving the living standards and the opportunities and the life chances of their people, and which countries have not been successful. If I look at the GDP per capita of the United States or Haiti or Colombia, or that's pretty informative of what it's like to be in those countries.
Yeah, it's a really complex thing. So so reading through your book, I got quite depressed, James. So so if you rewind time back 500,000 years, Homo sapiens, I would argue, continue to have a two-factor objective function. Food, recently replaced by wealth and money, and sex, which is basically a biological, programmatic need to spread your genes. And I don't think Homo sapiens have changed at all in the modern context. So if you have a two-factor objective function, what you're going to get is what we see, I think. Do you disagree?
Well, I think Homo sapiens has created these enormously elaborate societies, very, very rapidly. If you thought about the span of evolutionary history, this has all happened at in a kind of bat of an eyelid in some sense. And I think part of the problem is it's happening so fast and in such a complex way that we don't really understand it. We don't understand the consequences of things we're doing. Do we really understand the consequences of everybody having these cell phones and I mean, it's just, or think about this artificial intelligence. It's just so how it's so prone to unintended consequences. And I think somehow, for a couple of thousand years, maybe 10,000 years maximum, since the Neolithic Revolution, which you mentioned earlier, where you get this transition, in human society towards agriculture and kind of the development of urban life and society and specialization. And, there's a sort of phase transition takes place, but of course, that's nothing compared to these millions of years of human evolution. So I think somehow we've kept it on the rails, not always, think about, fascism and warfare and, so human society is prone to go off, on devastating tangents, and to develop kind of collective projects which are disastrous. And somehow we've kept it on the rails, for 10,000 years. But I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. As you're saying, we're sort of driven by fundamental things, but we can create these enormously elaborate societies on top of that, and it's not clear whether they're advantageous ultimately for kind of pushing our objectives, or in contradiction. Like many people would think, we're in the process of completely destroying the planet we're living on, and so there ultimately, we're destroying the ecosystem that has allowed us to flourish for millions of years, and I'm not sure I'm enough of a scientist, a relevant scientist to have a view on that, but it's clearly a possibility. I mean, when I talk to my colleagues here at the university who know much more about this, this is a possibility that they take very seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know much about this, James. So I'm going to chapter 7. So so I want to understand this, how political revolution in 1688 changed institutions in England and then to the Industrial Revolution. So this is quite a fundamental point of the book, right? You generally argue the systems matter, incentives matter,
Mm.
how we set it up, how hierarchical, how extractive the economy is matters. So what happened in 1688 in England?
Yeah, I mean that's a revolution. That was a transition from it was the emergence of constitutional monarchy. It was the defeat of an attempt to create an absolutist monarchy, and it created a far more inclusive political system in Britain. And it was like the rise of parliamentary sovereignty and constitutional rule, and then it led, we argue, to much more inclusive economic institutions. So that's, of course, why focus on Britain? Well, because we know that the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain, and the Industrial Revolution happens, starts about 50, 60 years after the Glorious Revolution. We're arguing that's not a coincidence. It's this political transition that lays the ground for more inclusive economic institutions that then lays the ground for the Industrial Revolution. So that's a momentous transition in the modern world. And, we want to explain that by this transition from extractive to inclusive institutions in Britain.
And so what you're arguing here is an industrial revolution, which had a huge impact on humans' lives, the utility of humans all around the world, um, really started by sort of an institutional change in England in the um, late 1688, you
Yeah.
say here.
Yeah, but it created a very different institutional environment. I think if you look, for example, at innovation, here, unlike with the Maya city-states, we have much better data. What you see is, following following the Glorious Revolution, you see this enormous surge in patenting, for example, in Britain, which is a very good marker of innovation. People were patenting, people were innovating, they were taking out patents on their innovations. And I think you see many of these technologies which are so associated with the industrial revolution and the modern world, development of the steam engine, for example, and mechanization of production, the factory system, many things that we just take for granted now. We can't imagine they didn't exist, but and railways, like transportation technology, all of this stuff comes, steel ships, whatever. And then there's, of course, this is all followed by electricity and, many other kind of inventions and innovations. But it's sort of the Industrial Revolution that gets this thing going, and it's almost like the systemization of innovation too. Innovation becomes much more professionalized, it becomes much more institutionalized, it becomes like not a kind of one-off thing like Isaac Newton with the apple falling on his head and inventing gravity. It becomes something like, yeah, we understand this. We put resources into it. We invest in it. We work with science. It becomes like something systematic in the way that it never had done before. That's absolutely critical. To thinking about the last 250 years also.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, James, so what you're arguing is that the two-factor objective function remains unless you have returns to innovation, patenting, intellectual property accruing to the inventor. The inventor is not going to do it. I mean, it's a pretty simple equation, right? It's all about utility.
Yeah, I mean, we don't, our view of the world, which is pretty simple, at least in my experience, working in different parts of the world, is that, people in the Congo, they want exactly what you and I have. They want access to, to opportunities, to schools, to good healthcare, to universities, to, they want to travel, they want, but why don't they? Because they don't have the opportunities. They don't have
Constraints, yeah.
because so I think, like, our view of humans is sort of like, I mean, after all, we go back and you go back 50,000 years or 60,000 years, most humans are related to a bunch of people who kind of moved out of Africa, who came from East Africa and then spread around the world. So I think, like, our view, we're not saying here there are big differences in people, at some kind of fundamental genetic or human level, but you put humans in very different incentive environments and they're going to behave in very different ways, so and I think, like, in some sense, there's, but what distinguishes humans also, though, is this sort of creativity. I guess, some people would say this is to do with our brains, like, what you look historically, for example, human brains, become bigger. And, if you look at the physiology of Homo sapiens compared to Neanderthals, you see these changes. We've and language allows us to communicate and discuss. And, like, why is it that most famous philosophical works, are dialogues? Plato's Republic is a dialogue, because we talk to each other, we argue, we learn, we reason, so I think that innovativeness of humans is something sort of, something remarkable, I mean, that, and that comes from, of course, these very slow moving, maybe physiological, sociological, or cultural changes. And that what's kind of explodes, in the last 250 years in ways, that people couldn't really, predict or kind of contain. I think there's something, I always think, like, here's an example I use, when I teach, which is, there's 9,000 species of ants, right? So ants, when ants came to Canada's cold, it's kind of barren, there's all these, like, ants speciated, so that a new type of ant emerged that was better adapted to Canada. But when Homo sapiens never speciated, when we got to Canada, what did we do? We invented igloos, and we developed the taste. And ice fishing, and we developed a taste for seal blubber. Like, humans adapt and they innovate and they can create different societies and different like, I think that's something about humans. It's just sort of remarkable. We're remarkably kind of innovative and creative.
Yeah, humans also have a selection advantage in the sense that, I mean, you talk about this in the book. The Spanish and the Portuguese went to South America and Central America, colonized that first. So temperature, closeness to equator mattered in terms of how to do it. And then by the time the English came, there's only North America left. It's sort of barren. And so, yeah, I mean, I think humans can, in some sense, we have more flexibility than ants. I would argue, right? Is that true?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm not a, I'm not a, I'm not a biologist, or I'm not, but I think that's clear. Like, how I would want to describe that fundamentally, I think obviously we have these much bigger brains, and that gives us enormous kind of capabilities that ants don't have, to create and innovate, and and I mean, I think this example you're talking about, the Americas. Yeah, it's true that, of course, people were very interested in, sugarcane or tobacco or, these sort of tropical crops. And so the tropics looked like places where, there was just much more money to be made, if we go back 400 or 500 years. But I guess for us, the important thing is not sugarcane or whatever, but the type of societies that led to, the type of society based on slavery or, very hierarchical extractive institutions. That's what's significant in the long run, how those initial conditions led to very different types of societies.
I'm thinking, James, that if the greatest president ever gets back to the White House in the US, I'm going to go buy an island and I'm going to make it free for any technologists to come in and innovate. And I think I can make that island a very interesting country pretty
Yeah,
quickly.
there's all sorts of schemes like that. I was reading in the newspaper about this scheme in Northern California. Now, haven't all these like tech people bought all this land and they want to create this city like somewhere near the Napa Valley? Is it? I can't remember the name of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's happening. I mean, for a while it was New Zealand. A lot of people were actually leaving the US, go to New Zealand. I think stuff like that is going to happen. I think, yeah, I mean, I would argue US is at great risk of losing everything that it has built up
Yeah.
last 90, 100 years, let's say.
Well, if you think about it, like this modern nation state, is a very recent creation. If you went back and looked historically at Europe, you find city states, the Hanseatic League, you find an enormous proliferation of different types of political institutions. It's only in the 19th century, that Germany emerges or Italy emerges out of something much more decentralized and heterogeneous. So why couldn't that be recreated? Yeah, I think, again, I think looking at history as it's salutary, right? Because you see, we are innovative and we can come up with different ways of doing things. And why not? You have to change and adapt when the world changes.
Yes, so I understand. So in chapter 9, you say how European colonialism impoverished large parts of the world. So this is um, this is a larger topic. Um, so what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, again, colonialism was very heterogeneous. The United States was created by European colonialism. So was Australia and New Zealand, and so these were but typically, the story that we have, the argument we make is that Europeans were interested in creating extractive institutions wherever they could, and they did that in Latin America or large parts of Africa or India. That's what they did, or the Middle East. But why didn't they do that in the United States or Australia? Well, they did. They tried to, but basically there was no one to exploit. So they try. If you look at the early, we tell the story of the early history of the United States, of the Virginia, the Jamestown colony. I mean, what's interesting about that is that they absolutely had this model of like creating extractive institutions. It just didn't work. It didn't work in Virginia. And so then there was this period of experimentation of like, okay, that's not going to work. How do we do, what do we do? Like this kind of experimenting with different models, and then that's when they came up with a far more inclusive way of organizing institutions, so I think so colonialism had these, heterogeneous effects, I would say, if I was being more nerdy, you know, but while it was creating the United States and Australia and New Zealand, of course, it was, it was immiserating huge, other parts of the world, expropriating land, enslaving people, taking natural resources. That's the story in Africa. It's the story in Latin America, India, large
But
parts of South Asia.
why did it not work in Virginia, James? I couldn't quite understand it. I mean, compared to South America, what was different about Virginia?
Well, because there were very few indigenous people on the ground. So early Spanish colonization was basically, it was based on the exploitation of indigenous people. So they took over indigenous society and then used indigenous people, basically kind of enslaved indigenous people. I mean, it's not exactly the institution of slavery. The Spanish had other institutions. And that was the model that the British had in mind when they came. But, the eastern seaboard of the United States, indigenous people were very few on the ground, and they
It's
quickly.
empty. It's empty, basically.
Yeah,
It was practically empty. Yeah.
and then the Virginia Company realized that their model was to create this colonial society based on exploiting indigenous people, but it was actually impossible. Think of Australia; it's the same thing. What you see in Australia, again, Aboriginal society, Aboriginal population was very thin on the ground. It was like focused much more on the center of the continent. And and it was impossible to also Aboriginal society was very decentralized. It didn't have political structures. If you look at the colonization of the Americas, that worked much better in places where there were already centralized indigenous societies, like the Central Valley of Mexico or in Peru, in the these Andean civilization, the Inca, so then the Spanish could kind of take over these pre-existing hierarchies. You didn't have those hierarchies in Australia. You didn't have those hierarchies in the eastern seaboard of the United States. So that model didn't work. It didn't work. And you couldn't grow sugarcane either. You couldn't grow many of these tropical crops.
It's too cold. It was too cold. For
Exactly.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but again, you know, the reason that's important is for explaining the type of institutions that emerged. You know, and so that's that. You know, that history of the United States, and you know, I'm talking very early on about Virginia and Jamestown, but what we show in the chapter is that it gets repeated in Maryland, it gets repeated in you know in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You know, there's these endless attempts which actually fail to create extractive institutions in the United States, and a very different type of society emerges. And actually, the same story happens in Australia. You know, we point out that in Australia, you know, when the colonization of Australia starts, it's a sort of penal colony run by the military, for heaven's sake. You know, it was completely extractive, but that society wasn't viable. You know, it wasn't viable, and then they start experimenting. You know, the soldiers wanted to make money. You know, and they had a monopoly of rum. So they thought we can make money by selling rum to the convicts, but the convicts didn't have any money, so they couldn't afford to buy rum. So what do? Give the convicts some freedom, let them give them some property, let them have land, let them start businesses, let them, you know. So we tell these stories of like how these much more inclusive. I mean, Australia is a sort of remarkable place, you know, because it goes from being this penal colony to possibly one of the most inclusive societies in the world in about 50 years. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great, James. So in conclusion, I wondered if you could speculate a bit. So we are here in the US, and so we say this is the oldest democracy in the world. Um, that's
If
so to speak.
counts, yeah. That we could argue about that. Yeah.
We have some very large democracies to the east, and we have elections coming up in all these places. And we see signs of, I would say, I mean, this is my bias, things going backward in many places. And so are we sort of witnessing sort of the first instances? I mean, we have seen it, you know, as you say, in Argentina, Soviet Union, and elsewhere, that things go really good for a while and then turn back. Are we seeing that type of a trend in these countries?
I mean, you know, we're certainly seeing a trend in that direction. You know, whether it's going to like destroy American institutions, we don't know yet. You know, I think, you know, President Trump basically has no commitment whatsoever to democracy, and you know, many Republican politicians seem to have no commitment either, in the sense that, you know, they maintain that he was cheated out of power, and that's a complete lie. There's no evidence that, you know, he was cheated. He lost the election, but he maintains he won the election. You know, so for me, that shows those people have no commitment to democracy. And I think, you know, you have to think that were he to win the election, they would do everything they could to try to undermine the democratic process in this country. And I think there's only one way that is going to end up, you know, it's if it succeeds. You know, I mean, what we also saw in the last election is many people are willing to fight against that, you know, at their own, you know, at the expense of their own interests. And you know, I think there were some remarkable heroics in that last election in terms of people doing their duty and like fighting for the institutions in terms of the, you know, so that's what we're reliant on. You know, I mean, I think that's where we are in this country. And you know, I think one thing you could do if you looked at history was to say it's not the first time institutions in this country have been challenged. You know, like, you know, Franklin, you know, FDR in the 1930s. After all, Roosevelt stayed in power. You know, he violated George Washington, you know, the first president, set this precedent that, you know, he basically said no president should be there for more than 2 terms. And everyone respected that until Roosevelt, you know, in the 1930s. And Roosevelt stayed in power, you know, way after he should have left. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. You know, he did all sorts of very naughty things, Roosevelt. Now, everyone's forgotten about that now. They just remember the good things. But I think he did things that Trump would be kind of unimaginable to Trump, you know, like, so So I think
Hope he's not reading history books because he'll get some ideas.
I don't think he reads books, Donald Trump. So I think there have been very bad presidents in the United States before, and the institutions have been challenged. Think about the Civil War, for heaven's sake. What was that other than a kind of conflict over the institutions of the country? That's a pretty scary thought, no? It
Yeah,
was.
so I remember Angela Merkel saying, when I leave, I will leave with no drama. And that's what leaders do.
Yeah, she
And so what are your thoughts on India? How it's sort of shaping up? I mean, we talk about the caste system. There is an underlying religious thing going on here. So, what are your thoughts on that in contemporary?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the evidence shows is that, many different religious systems are consistent with having an inclusive economy. I always when I teach, I always use the example of Japan. Look at Japan. Japanese religion looks nothing like Western religion.
Yeah.
Shintoism, and the whole notion of deity and like one's relationship with God, and how what a good life looks like. I mean, it's completely different from Western ideas of religion. And so I feel there's many. Think about the United Arab Emirates. Whatever, like that's a very Muslim country. It's a very Islamic society. They've made huge strides economically in the past 30 or 40 years. So I don't see religion as being. I think there's a lot of freedom for people to practice religion, and in their own way, and I think what you saw in India, is in the 90s, and you saw a transition towards more inclusive institutions, a kind of opening of the economy, the dismantling of many of like what economists used to call the license Raj in India. And what you saw? You saw a pickup in economic growth. You saw a lot of economic dynamism in India. I mean, I think that, the fact of the matter is there's still lots of institutional problems in India, and that's why, it hasn't done what China has done. But and as I do think obviously the caste system is related to, but religion can be interpreted and reinterpreted, I'm pretty sure Indians can find a model of growth which is sort of consistent with their cultural values, but also creates the kind of economic inclusion that that we know is necessary for innovation and rapid economic growth.
Excellent, James. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Okay, my pleasure. Yeah, it's been
Thank
fun.
you.
Yes. Okay.